Hello, and welcome to the Smart Money Simplified podcast with your host, Brent Mekosh. Brent, good to be with you again. What have we got on the table today?
We discuss a lot of things when we do these podcasts together, Bill, and three of my favorite topics. We don't always hit all of them during every episode, but money, religion, and politics. And those are my three. They're the three taboo subjects, and
All
there's
of
three.
them, yes.
Yeah, they're the three. Yeah, and as long as I have been alive, basically, those have been three of my favorite things to talk about. And I think in today's conversation with David Yep, we're going to really dive into religion quite a bit. We're also going to dive into money as well, because this guy I finished his book last night. It's called Uncollared, and we're going to talk about that, where he had a journey into the Catholic priesthood, or you weren't officially a priest, were you, David?
No, I was an almost priest. I gave
And
it a
so
little bit more than the college try. It's
But
13
it
years.
was it was quite, yeah, 13 years, correct? Is that how long you were involved and on that path? And then ultimately left that, and then now is vice president and chief revenue officer rather, at TRIUNE Health Group. So, we've got religion on one side, we've got business on the other side. But the book Uncollared, get on Amazon and check this out. And I'll make this offer right now that the first 10 people that come back to me and listen to this podcast and want a copy of this book, reach out to me, DM me directly, email me, and I will be happy to send you a copy, because I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it. And I know probably a lot of today's conversation, David, I really want to dive into some of the things that you talk about in that book. But let's start with your personal history, because people think of a 13-year-old generally, and you think this is a young kid, and it's not necessarily somebody that now is going to go away on this massive life transition, this massive life path, very different than where you left. So tell me what happened when you were 13.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't actually typically go back to that to the whole story when I wrote the book. I didn't include the entire first part, which is sort of the biography and kind of the story about being in the seminary. But it was my producer that I work with. He's like, you got to tell this story. He's like, this has flavors of a Jay Shetty who studied to be a monk and a Buddhist monk and then left and became a life coach. He's like, so you got to tell this. So in a nutshell, Brent, it's all very simple to me, which is why it's only been decades later that I kind of look back on it, and by telling the story and people telling me how weird and how strange and how like extraordinary it is, that I've kind of like started to look back at it and say, okay, I guess it is a lot. But when I was going through it, I mean, I was a young boy, raised Catholic, very Catholic, and I was just a zealous person. Like I wanted to do great things with my life. Like that's always been, kind of part of my DNA. And my logic as a kid was pretty simple. I was taught that the greatest thing you can do is to lay down your life for someone else. And so for me, it's like, okay, well, I'm either going to do that through the Marines. I'm going to join the military and lay down my life for other people, or I'm going to become a priest. And becoming a priest didn't sound very attractive at the time. I was only kind of exposed to, older parish priests who were, obviously committed to their ministry, but didn't really make an impact on a young boy until I met this very, vibrant, enthusiastic religious order within the Catholic Church. I saw these seminarians. These were enthusiastic guys, charismatic, good looking. And I'm like, that I can do. These are people who are trying to change the world. And so with my very simple, logic of an 11-year-old and, the heart of a lion, I'm like, that's what I want to do. My parents were extremely supportive and said, yeah, go for it. So at 13, I left home, and I joined the seminary. It ended up being 13 years that I was in the seminary. And as a religious, so within the Catholic Church, you have kind of normal priest, and then you have religious priest, and it's kind of like someone might not like this analogy, but it's kind of like the special forces versus the regular military, right? The special forces have longer training, you make vows, and you kind of have a more rigorous lifestyle in a lot of ways than those who kind of serve in your typical parishes. So 13 years, I didn't actually become a priest, but I was a religious for many of those years with vows. And yeah, took me kind of all over in that path.
I think that leap when you were 13 years old is bigger than you let on here, because you didn't join a seminary that was down the street. You left rural Illinois
That's
and
true.
you went to New Hampshire, and you had really basically holidays and 2 weeks a year was the only time you saw your family from that point on.
It was
Correct?
intense. Yeah, it was I mean, they treated us like little priests. And as I've gone back and tried to sort out the I don't call them wounds, I look at all of it as lessons and things that we learned, and certainly there were negative things throughout that experience that I learned, but yeah, it was very rigorous. talk to our parents once a week. We used to write letters home once a week. Suffice to say, I don't know that I would let my children at 13 go and do this, right? And it's a different belief system, but it was a big jump. It was across the country, which may have been across the world. I mean, you're from out east, and East Coasters are to Midwesterners what Martians are to most Earthlings.
Yeah, very true.
We come with our typical Midwestern warmth and friendliness, and you get greeted with a little bit more of a colder. So yeah, it was quite the jump, and I think that is probably what appealed to me, is the fact that it was so radical and so big, and doing something great like that.
And what was that experience like at 13? So the first portion of your training was 4 years, correct? Was
It was 4
teachers?
years, yeah. Which so we did high school in 3 years. It was an accelerated program because of the intensity of the studies. Our high school only lasted 3 years, so I did 8th grade and then 3 years of high school. So those were the 4 years. I talk about this in my book. Like it was, in a lot of ways, it was fearless. Like I didn't calculate fear. It was something that I was running to, and not something I was running away from. And I was excited. There were a lot of challenges, in all boys school, which, as a 13-year-old kid with high levels of testosterone, I mean, that was amazing. I like snowball fights where you've got like 30 boys against 30 boys, and you're like running up and down the side of the White Mountains. Like, you can't get any better than that. Capture the flag, running through the forest, massive dodgeball games, soccer tournaments, basketball games. Like, it was a boy's dream in a lot of ways, except for the absence of girls, obviously. But there was a lot I loved about it. In fact, I should send this picture, but we recently did a reunion of our generation that graduated, and those guys and I have stayed very close. It's this kind of brotherhood of boys who left home when they were in their teens, were living in a seminary. I mean, all the rigors of silence. Like, half the day we weren't allowed to talk. Because those were the rules. You lived in silence. You woke up in the morning, you had 15 minutes to get showered and have your hair perfectly combed, your shoes perfectly shined, and then be in the chapel for morning prayers. And it was all in silence. After last prayers at night, it was absolute silence, no talking aloud. So, it was rigorous, but I think I accepted that all as a challenge and part of what it was that I wanted to do.
Was there ever a time where you arrived there, because you're a young kid, where you had real questions like, wow, or were you just full on the entire time from the second you got there?
No, I think questions were always a part of it. It wasn't questions because of like, oh, I missed my family. I love them a lot, but I didn't feel that, miss. And you can probably relate to some of that in your travels. When you're engrossed in the moment, you don't always think about what it is that you left behind. I think I doubted, all the time, is this what I was meant to do? There was a time when I was like, maybe I wasn't supposed to be with the Legionaries of Christ, which is the name of the order. I was like, oh, maybe I should just go back to the diocese, and be a regular parish priest. There were times where I was like, yeah, can I do this? I talk about this in the book, like the concept of celibacy and no sex is something that was challenging for me the whole time. And I was always like, you feel, obviously as a young boy, like you're a horny little
Yeah.
bastard. But I was also in an element of innocence where I didn't really know. Like, I had no, real sex education. I had no, like, I hadn't dated girls. I didn't really understand all of that. You just have these feelings. And so, yeah, it did kind of create the conflict from day one. Like, is this what I'm supposed to do? But it was sort of a, nope, this is what I believe God is calling me. This is where my heart's going. And so I'm just going to plow forward.
So now you're 17 and you head over to Europe at that point. It was over to Germany first, correct?
Yeah, I head over to Germany, which was also, as I look back, I see so clearly how my footsteps were, just guided by God, guided by creation, the universe, whatever you want to call it. I was not slated to be sent overseas. So after you would graduate, there were kind of different centers all around the world, and you'd be sent to one or the other, and the majority of my graduating class stayed in the US to go on to what's called the novitiate, the first phase of religious life. And I was actually kind of a shoe-in at the end. And I'll always be grateful to the superior who kind of added my name to the end of the list and had me sent to Germany. It was kind of, I think a lot of us as young kids, we had the dream of like, hey, we want to get sent overseas, want to go somewhere exotic, want that experience. And I certainly had that too. They picked it probably based off of brains. The smart ones went to Germany, and I'm not dumb, but I wasn't I wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. So they probably thought, hey, he's not going to be the one to go and learn German. Actually proved them wrong. My language skills are very good. Thanks be to God. I have quite the knack for learning languages, but yes, at 17, the path led forward to Germany.
And what'd you do when you were there?
So Germany, so those are 2 years in novitiate, and those are kind of the most rigorous of religious life. I mean, that's where, again, we are in silence for 92% of the day. We don't speak. It's a time of prayer and study. That's really what it was. I was actually, before this call, I was going to try and calculate how many hours I think I have spent in prayer over my life and during that time in the seminary. But it was on average 4 to 5 hours of prayer a day. We'd wake up, go to pray for about 2 hours in the morning, and go to breakfast. Then we would have housework, different things to keep the house tidy. And then it was study, prayer, lunch, study, prayer, 25 minutes of calisthenics to, burn the energy off, and then back to more prayer and studying. That was pretty much the day. I saw my family once during those 2 years. And a very, the whole point within religious life is to prepare you for your vows, which you do after 2 years of novitiate. So it's kind of like a dating period or an engagement period in some ways for the religious orders to see, is this candidate right for religious life? And so it's very intense, very, very, very disciplined, very rigorous, but also beautiful memories. I was in Germany. It was my first time being outside the US. I had been outside the US before, but first time living outside the US. And, that brought a whole gamut of learning experiences too. I was a very fervent American, to say the least, and also kind of the school that America is the best country in the world and everybody else sucks. And so that was a big bucket of cold water to start to learn the beauty of other cultures and the truth that other countries could, teach me. Sort of a culture shock for a bit there.
Now, if you're spending 5.5 hours a day in prayer, what were you praying for? Are we talking the rosary and other rote Catholic prayers, or was it?
Great question. Great question. So it's a combination of kind of devotionals, to say it in one way. So kind of structured prayer. So obviously mass every day, rosary every day, different litanies every day. So there's kind of like the set prayers that we would pray, and then more meditative prayers. It's funny because, when I kind of experienced more of Eastern religion and started to understand, meditation, like I was like, okay, meditation, it's very interesting because we did meditation all the time. And so many people that I run into now, when they ask me to teach them how to pray or teach them how to meditate, one of the biggest things is that I don't meditate for a purpose. Like I don't meditate to try to reach a goal. For me, meditation is about getting myself into the space in order to receive the grace that God has given me. And so we did learn a lot of that actually in the seminary, how to contemplate. You would take a scene from the Bible, a scene from Jesus, and just kind of contemplate it. You would take a book and read that passage with a lot of contemplation. And so that brought a ton of interior depth, which has served me so well to take something, to reflect on it, to see how you feel about it, to see how your soul is moved on it. It's a lot more structured than my prayer is now and the way I meditate now. But yeah, to answer your question, kind of that combo of the things that were rehearsed and then that you would recite, and then sort of that free reign prayer, meditation, contemplation.
Yeah, that's a lot of hours doing that. Did you ever have any blast of insight during that time?
I fell asleep a lot. It's a lot of falling asleep. I did lots of stories of, brothers. So we were called brothers, not father. We brothers as religious. And there'd be, times when brothers were standing up in the chapel trying to keep themselves awake. Because when you're kneeling, it's pretty easy to put your elbows up and you kind of nod off. And so they would stand up to keep themselves awake. And so there were quite a few times where you'd see a brother kind of like flip over the pew in front of him, having fallen asleep. So, definitely lots of light, and things that set the foundation. When I talk about religion, which I'm very curious to kind of hear your conclusions after all of your journeys, having experienced so much and seen so much. When I talk about religion, I'm very quick to tell people that my experience of Catholicism is not the experience of probably 90% of the people. Like a lot of people are brought up in a religion and they learn the customs, they learn the rules, they learn the theology, they don't always learn the spirituality. I was given the gift of really understanding and diving deep into Catholic spirituality. Like, I truly have a relationship with Jesus in a way that most people don't, because it was this depth of prayer. It was trying to really understand who was Jesus Christ, like what was the message he was bringing, what does love mean, and so it's a deep dive and in a very pure place of the heart to try to experience. So to answer your question, yeah, there were tons of lights and insights. I have books, actually diaries from the times, poems that I used to write, spiritual poems. I love writing poetry, so I would capture my feelings and emotions in spiritual poetry. So yeah, very very deep in that regard.
And how would you define a difference between theology and spirituality?
Great question. I think that theology is sort of the building blocks. It's the difference between science and art. If I had to pick an analogy for it, science is the way things work, or at least the way we think things work, as well as we can understand them. Quantum physics has thrown Copernican physics, Newtonian physics on its head, and we don't really know exactly how things work anymore, or we have different understanding. But that's what theology is. It's like explain kind of the logic, the mental process, and like how different things work. What is creation? What is, how does the Trinity, which is the Catholics' concept of God, it's the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Like, how does that work? What is the relationship between them? It's a very intellectual in a lot of ways. The spiritual is the art. It's kind of your experience of it. It's the how it gets expressed in you. And if anything, one of the things that I think that religion can fall short on is neglecting the personal experience, is that you are going to experience God in a completely unique way because of who you are. And that's the art of it. That's the spirituality piece of understanding who you truly are in order to have that experience with the transcendental, with the divine, in a way that's very uniquely yours. You can study art theory. You can study, how to chip away at a piece of granite. You can study what tools to use and light shadow. But Michelangelo making the Pietà is Michelangelo making the Pietà. Like, he is going to do it in a way that only he can. And so I think that's a little bit the difference.
Now, another question for you. During these times of deep contemplation, you mentioned you had some experiences with light. Did you ever have any experiences with extreme darkness?
Yeah. Darkness, Brent, has been it's been a part of life always. And I think a lot about that, actually. We were on a call the other day with Epic Fit, and they were talking about the need for suffering and how suffering has to be a part of life. I don't know that I agree with that. I don't know that suffering has to be a part of life. I think that pain is a part of life. I think that if you look at nature, plants, seeds die, and then plants grow from that, and that's painful. But I don't think it's suffering, because the plant understands, as much as a plant can understand, that the seed dying is part of it giving new life. So I think suffering was a great part of what I went through, probably because in some ways I wasn't where, because I was still learning how to listen to my heart. And so there were a lot of conflict there, and there was a lot of darkness with trying to make it fit, and I think that there's extreme moments of which exacerbated through the years. And I talked about it in the book. And then going back to that celibacy piece, which was really eventually what took me away from the seminary, is I'm like, I can't, like, I'm not going to live without sex. I'm not going to live without marriage or a relationship. And so that feeling of guilt of trying to live this, and this extreme disconnect, created a ton of darkness, because you're wrestling with it. You're wrestling with temptation. You're wrestling with, we call temptation, right? You're wrestling with this conflict of, I am not living in line with who I'm supposed to be and who I want to be. And I think that to me is one of the greatest moral sufferings that people go through. Like, we suffer from all sorts of things that come to us, not understanding, not knowing where to go. But when you feel a misalignment between what you want to be and who you think you should be and who you are, to me, that's one of the greatest existential sufferings because you're lost. You don't know who you are. You have no identity, because you're like, they don't line up. So yeah, there were definitely moments of darkness. I think some of that is due to that conflict, and some of that is just due to the nature of things that I don't agree with within, how that structure is. I don't agree anymore with people living that life in that way, or at least that life doesn't work for me. And so that disconnect, I think, led to those moments of darkness too.
So Germany, and then on to Rome. So you're now basically at the mothership
Well, I went
of the Catholic faith, basically.
with a 2-year stop in Spain, actually. So
Okay.
after Germany, do vows, go to Spain. Spain is our equivalent of college, or of our associate's degree in college. Liberal arts, which was amazing. And then after Spain, went on to Rome for philosophy, which is our bachelor's. Yeah, and that's kind of the mothership. It's kind of like the core of, at least, especially the way I saw it back then, it was the core of Catholicism. It's like, being close to the Pope and the cardinals and the Vatican, and that was also the headquarters of our congregation. So it was kind of like going to HQ.
Did you ever have an opportunity to have an audience with the Pope?
I did, yes.
Was it Ratzinger at the time, or
Yes, it's funny. There's a picture of me. There's a picture of me shaking, kind of standing right next to Ratzinger, because he was Germany. He was German, obviously, and so when we went to visit Rome as German novices, we had a private mass with Ratzinger. There was like 10 of us, and so we were around him. And then I also had a chance to shake his hand and say hello to him. And when he went to visit Germany, and then I went to a bunch of audiences. So yes, there was all Ratzinger. Francis came along after I was gone. And I had been to an audience with John Paul II too before he died.
you did? Wow.
I
Because
did, yeah.
John Paul, in terms of I would say the legacy of popes. I mean, that guy. It's him. It's Thatcher. It's Reagan. It's Lech Walesa in Poland. I mean, these guys were giant, and women. In the case of Margaret Thatcher, these were giants of that era. What was John Paul like?
I actually love that point too. You brought that out, but the total sidetrack here, but you brought it out how the British, the English, understood the role of female authority, which I thought was really cool when you brought up the example of like monarchs
Oh, in my book.
Yeah, in your book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, just
Sorry.
for the listeners, David was kind enough to read my book, and yeah, there's a comment in there about the English respect for female authority.
Which I loved, as well as your book and your journey, and kind of how you experience all these things in a very pure and inquisitive and curious way. Which is honestly, that's the most, you said at the very beginning, you love talking about money, politics, and religion. I don't mind talking about any of those when it comes from the place of curiosity and authentic learning and true openness. And I think that brings a very different type of conversation. So honestly, I forgot your question. It was about John Paul II.
Yeah, John Paul II. Well, what I mean, was this guy, because as a non-Catholic, was this guy as remarkable of an individual as I look back and see him in history? Because I have read about two or three of his books I read in the past, and John Paul's always been a guy that I've had a lot of admiration for. Did you get a sense of that when you were around him in his presence?
Yeah, it's been fun to reflect on that too, because once I was able to kind of stand an arm's length away from religion and kind of look at things, then you start to see, okay, what's what, right? And obviously, when you're a seminarian, you're Catholic, so Legionaries of Christ were very, very close with the popes, which created difficulties later on. But you're taught like Vicar of Christ, successor of Peter. Like, this guy's basically the shit. I'm sorry for that. That's a very vulgar analogy, but for lack of a better word, like he is the holy of holies. And so there was an aura around him, going to meet the Pope, going to hear the Pope, the stories that were told about how amazing the Pope is, and all sorts of, like, you hear all of these stories that get told from this standpoint of faith and from this standpoint of reverence. And so then to take a step back and say, okay, yeah, but let's take the reverence and the faith out of it and look at this person more objectively. I have come to that conclusion that you have, which is like, he was an incredible person. I mean, and the way that he connected with multitudes and crowds, his fearlessness, his charism, his enthusiasm. He was a very unique example too of kind of the science and the art, because he has writings that are very scientific, they're very theological, but he also has writings that are very much of the heart. He was an artist. He liked to act in plays and theater, and loved music and things like that. And so he's someone who kind of embodied, I think, those two very well, and had such an impact on the world.
And there's a very big difference between the John Paul that left us and the last one that I think the Western consciousness remembers, and the guy that was initially the Pope. I mean, this guy was a Polish mountain climber. He was athletic. He was strong. He was young. And it was after, I think, the assassination attempt that really, physically at least, impacted him and changed him.
Yeah, he did. I mean, and again, I'm no expert on his biography, but he did certainly well even after the assassination, did well, but then it was towards the end where he really started to decline, from a health standpoint, and the last years he was quite feeble. But I think that, I think, Brent, it's the energy. And that's something that I've learned a lot about too. It's even now in my experience of Catholicism or any religion, like, I don't necessarily revere someone because they're a cardinal, because they're a priest, because they're a nun, because they're a Catholic, because they're Buddhist, because they're an imam, because they're a monk. Like that, to me, it doesn't give you a presence of God. I don't know, honestly. Like, does a priest have more divine grace in him than a normal person? I don't know. Does a monk have more spirituality and supernatural anything than a normal person? I don't know the answer. That's theology, and I've kind of given up trying to understand a lot of that. What I can say is that I listen to my heart when I'm with someone and say, does this person exude God? Do I feel the love of God in this person? And I don't care whether you're a bum on the street or whether you're a pope. To me, I'm more interested in experiencing God in you and your experience of God. And so in that regard, in my limited experience of John Paul II, like, he was a man of God. He was a man who exuded the love of God. And again, I didn't know him as a best buddy. I'm just saying, what I was able to experience. And to me, that's what's pure, and that's what's beautiful, and that's what the world needs. Like, the world needs more of these people who exude the love of the creator and who can allow people to experience God through them. And I find that, frankly, these days, I find it in people of all religions and people of no religion. It's, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the theology says that. I know what the theology says, but maybe I will die and come to heaven and it will say, hey, no, all the priests were holier than everybody else, or all the priests had more grace than everybody else. But my experience now is trying to discern who has that love of God radiating through them.
So you're in Rome, and obviously now probably 26 years old. So half of your life you've been on this track. I'm guessing a decision point came up where it's, hey, you now is the time where you are going to become a priest, or it's time to move on. And what was that
Sort of.
like?
Yeah, I had a little bit of ways to go still, which sounds funny. I technically, so I had to do apostolic practices internship, which was 1 to 3 years. I ended up doing 3 years in Austria, doing youth work, which I absolutely adored. And then after that, I would have maybe studied more philosophy and then done 3 years of theology and then been ordained. So I was about 4 years out from becoming a priest. And decision time kind of came for me in Austria. Although it wasn't really a set decision time. It wasn't like you're engaged and your wedding's coming up in a week. Now this is game time. You got to decide. It was more, I was in my 3rd year. I was struggling more and more with this disconnect. And, at some point the spirit was like, hey, this isn't going to work. And you're going to, it's not going to work. You got to go. And so I won't say I was kicked out, but it was pretty much like, hey, you can't continue. They made the decision, like, this is not going to work. And so I was heartbroken, because I still, in spite of all that conflict, I still wanted to power through and become a priest. And that was pretty much, a lot of people ask for the juicier details behind that. And, the reality is, it's like, I just kind of confronted the fact that, my sexuality and my desire to have a relationship was way too strong. And so then I was going to either live in conflict my whole life, or I was going to do something that would be scandalous as a priest who's not supposed to do any of that. It's interesting, I also observe all of that from the outside, and how many cases of pedophilia there are, how many cases of homosexual ministers there are, whether it's the priesthood or any other religion, how many cases of affairs or people fathering, which I don't look at any of that necessarily as. The point right now is not to judge whether that's good or evil. I just look at the human element of that, and when they're trying to live this celibacy, what happens when they're not meant to do that. And that was the position I was in. So
You talk a lot in your book. Obviously, there's a real focus on what true freedom looks like, but you also talk a lot about fear. And what was that like when half of your life now you've been on this track to become a priest? Suddenly you're not. And I would imagine that the whole concept of your own existence was sort of turned upside down at that point. Was that a fearful time, or were you able to fall back upon the years of meditation, and had you gotten to know yourself well enough at that point that you were able to move forward strongly?
I definitely didn't know myself well enough. I had some of that same enthusiasm, which is like, okay, let's go here, let's go to what's next. I felt like a failure. That's true. I felt like I had failed God and I had failed my vocation, and like I didn't make it. But it was a pretty quick course correct to say, okay, how do I go serve God now in a different capacity? And so, um, you know, is that meditation that served me? Is that the depth of my relationship with God? In some ways, there was a lot of trust there that I was going to find the right way. But I didn't know. It was like a voice that I heard that I didn't know was my heart, and it was kind of this voice that was saying, hey, you're going to be okay. There's a different way to do this. And so it was kind of like on to the next way. Like, okay, I can't be a priest, whatever, screw that. I'm going to go be an amazing, Catholic. I'm going to go into business and I'm going to change the world through business. So in some ways it was similar. The fear was never about what was coming next. It was, how do I do this in a way that is going to honor God and is going to honor myself too. Um, I mean, it was terrifying in some ways because I came home with nothing. Like I didn't, I had no money. I had never had a job. I didn't have a resume. I had to fight for my degree because our degree was in a pontifical university, and so like we had to go through a whole process to get our transcripts translated into the American system. I'd never had a girlfriend, never had a car, never had a credit card, never had a bank account. So I was like a 27-year-old baby that just had a big heart and was like, hey, I'm gonna figure life out, and I'm still gonna do something great with my life.
What was that like? I've talked to some guys that were operators over during the global war on terror, and we're in some very different circumstances than what we have in the United States. And a common theme I've gotten from all of them is when they return to the United States, our society and culture just felt superficial and silly to them. Did you have that same experience when you got back here to the U.S.?
100%. 100%. My girlfriend, or my wife now, but my girlfriend at the time, like, she used to see me staring off into the distance, and it was like, she's like, what's wrong? I'm like, it's just, things here don't make sense. Like, it's so insipid. It's so superficial. Like, I spent my life trying to do something good, and like, where every moment was about self-giving and doing something with an ulterior motive. And now you come back and like people care about shit that like I couldn't care less about. Like I didn't want to watch sports. I didn't want to go to a bar. I didn't want to get drunk. Like, I don't know. To me, it was very, very difficult to kind of adjust back to, my mom, um, one of the things that was difficult for her in a really silly example is like I would come home, I was at home and she'd be like, hey, do you want Coke or Sprite? And I'd be like, I don't care. Like they're like either one. She's like, well, you have to like one or the other. And I'm like, I like them both, I like, they're both great, which to you as a layperson or, to not having experience probably sounds so silly. But to me, we didn't used to get Coke or Sprite as seminarians. Like it was a very rare occasion. And when we got it, it was whatever was donated. And so they truly, to me, they were both equally amazing, and to come back into a world where I had to care about whether I'm drinking Coke or Sprite, it was like, this is stupid, right? This is superficial, as you said. And to your point, we've often compared ourselves to the military. I don't know the military would feel like we deserve that comparison, but we know what we went through. I mean, we know the sacrifice, we know the intensity of the formation we were in, and no, we were never shot at. And no, we never shot at other people, but we did really tough things. And, that leaves a mark, and that leaves this kind of feeling of like, how do I fit in and how do I now incorporate into civilian or lay life coming back?
So how'd you do it?
balls to the wall. I just jumped in, and that has led to the reflections about fear that I kind of talk about in the book, is that when you are obsessed by the passion and you are consumed by the ideal and what you're fighting for, or the love that you have, you don't think about the fear. So I just jumped in, feet first, which is so funny. I was very naive, very naive. My wife, she'll often tease me about the fact that I never asked her to date because I didn't know that that was a thing. Like um, we met at a Starbucks, and I, found this girl who I really liked because she was just so authentic, and we just started hanging out. And so I would invite her to go to things, and it was 4 or 5 months in, she's like, well, I don't really know what we're doing here. And I'm like, what do you mean what we're doing? Like, I thought you're my girlfriend. And she's like, well, you never asked me to date you. And I'm like, I didn't know that was it. I didn't know you're supposed to ask someone to date you. Sorry. So that's kind of like symbolic of everything. I remember when I was a little kid, Christmas came around, and we used to get, the model airplanes or model boats to build. And my parents gave me or Santa gave me a model World War II airplane. I think it was like a Japanese Spitfire, or no, a Spitfire. Um, and I was like, okay, whatever. And then my younger brother got this like red 1969 Mustang Mach 1. And I remember looking at that like, oh man, I wish I had that. Um, so when I came home from the seminary, driving down the street, I'm like, I'm gonna go buy a Mustang. But I had no idea about, like, credit score and how much money I needed to have. I just looked at it and said, okay, $350, I can make that monthly payment, so I'm gonna do it. And so kind of really just in a naive way, but also in a very pure way, like a child, just kind of going through life and doing that. I was very blessed that my dad had a company, and he gave me an entry level job in the company. I was doing AR, so I was calling all the people that owe us money and asking them to pay us. And so I was making, a little bit of money to kind of get me by, but I knew that I wanted to get an education. I knew that I wanted to go to business, and so I applied to business school, and it was a miracle that I got in that too, because I didn't have, finance background. I didn't have, you know, um, I didn't have a resume of having worked in a corporate job. It was a non-traditional MBA, and they value people who live lives of meaning. And so they saw my story, and they're like, this is the kind of person we want. And so same thing. I went and took out a loan for the entirety of the tuition. I never, thought twice about it. I just went and did it. And so things kind of started to fall into place.
And so talk about where you are right now and what you're doing with TRIUNE.
So I after completing my MBA, I went into managing non-for-profits, went to a manufacturing company and helped scale that quite a bit. And then I was working on my own startup, actually in food delivery, which I'd probably be a gazillionaire if I had done that. And at that time, my dad had started a company in 1990, and it was going through some challenges. They had a really solid business. They didn't know how to scale it, or it wasn't scaling as much as they needed it to. And that was kind of my passion, was how to grow businesses. And so my dad and I talked a long time, and he's like, "Hey, I'd really like you to come back to the business." Um, and I did a lot of discernment, what felt like my mission, my vocation. I was still very, very altruistic at the time, and altruistic in a way that I didn't always consider what was in my best interest. I considered what I could do for others. And so I determined, okay, I was going to come back to TRIUNE, which is in healthcare and insurance. And after coming back, realized that the best thing for the business, for my parents, for my brother who was in the business, and even for my siblings who were not in the business, was going to be to transition the business to a next generation. And so I convinced my dad to sell the company, both my parents actually, because they owned it together. Convinced my parents to sell the company to my brother and I. And so for the last 6 years, professionally, I've been running TRIUNE together with my brother James.
And what do you consider next generation business? What did that transition look like to you?
So we completely bought the company from my parents, and so we're G2, and we own it, we run it. My dad still comes in once in a while. He popped in not too long ago to chat and see how things were going, and he still likes to hang around a little bit. But for all practical purposes, we own the business, and we run it. So it's scaled quite a bit since we've been here. It's taken off. I think we bring a different perspective to things, maybe a little bit more energy, and allowed us to kind of change a little bit as the industry has changed. And also kind of imprint our own philosophy onto it. My dad had his way of doing things. My mom, collaborated with him, and now you've got younger leadership who sees the world differently and kind of puts that into place. But at our foundation has always been company culture, something that we protect, taking care of our people, something very precious to us. And so that's something that we still continue to strive to live, encouraging our people to live, virtues and values on the field and off the field in the same way.
And who's the target market for you now? Who are you serving?
So we serve insurance companies, or large employers. So companies like Southwest Airlines, Chick-fil-A, companies that you would recognize, big hotel chains. Like they basically anyone who has to take care of the person who gets injured on the job. So if you're working at a construction site, a piece of concrete falls and shatters your leg, they would contact us. Most of our employees are nurses, and basically they would assign a nurse to you to help you get better faster. So it's the insurance company who's paying us to help you get better faster, or it's your employer who pays us directly to help you get better faster.
And what have you done to really change the business? And what do you see as being the main challenges for the future in your industry? And what are you doing to address it to try to get ahead of that?
I think the biggest change has been looking at things from a bigger picture. And I give a lot of thanks to my time in Europe, and time outside of the country for that, because it taught me to look at the world in a different way, and see like there's the way that you do things, but there are also ways that you've never considered about doing things. And so it gave me an openness to everything, to politics, to money, to religion, all three of those things an openness to consider that there's truths other places. A very concrete example here. When my parents ran the business, my brother was here. We didn't really talk to competitors. Like competitors were kind of like the enemy. You don't talk to them. It's like, hey, what am I going to talk to them about? I'm the opposite. I talk to all my competitors, anybody that wants to talk to me. And, I created a network actually of owners of case management companies, which is what we do, case management. I created a network of them all across the country. And we've actually ended up acquiring 3 companies from that network of people that I've just started to talk to, because they realized they wanted to get out. They know our values, they know what we stand for. And so because of those relationships, like it's allowed us to grow inorganically. Organically, it's been a lot of understanding that, just because you're a company that cares about people doesn't mean that you don't hold people accountable. And there can be a misinterpretation in being nice. And that's something that I think happens a lot. And it's hard for people to understand. Like when you love somebody, it doesn't mean that you just let them bowl you over. It doesn't mean that you lose yourself at the same time. And so I think there was an element of TRIUNE having to learn that, yes, we were a company that cared for people, but if we wanted to care for people, we had to be the best. And so holding people accountable, and there's a little bit of cleanup work to be done, honestly. And I think that's something that I brought to the table, and that we sorely needed. So you've got the organic growth inside, because now you're turning on more engines, and you've got the inorganic growth of kind of growing. Our industry has a lot of outside private equity money coming into it. And so to be a family-owned business that's second generation, that's been around for 35 years, like that's pretty cool. And I think when I first came back to the business, I knew that what my parents fought for was what they believed. Like they believed in treating people right. They believed in the dignity of the human person, that everybody deserves human dignity and respect. They believed that. And so that's why they ran the business the way they did. What I realized is, yes, that's what we believe, but this is also really marketable. And this is also something that really sets us aside in the industry, because we're not private equity owned. We're not going to sell off in 3 years. We are a company whose leadership really believes in this and tries to live it. And so understanding what your core values are is important to continuing to preserve your identity as a company, but then it also can become what truly makes you marketable. And those are those key success factors that will allow you then to grow and to expand to the clients that want you.
And how would you articulate the core values of TRIUNE?
We are a company that truly values culture first, that we really put our people first. And that impacts the kind of work that we do. It impacts the kind of clients that we want to work with. Not every client appreciates what the nurse does. and there are case management companies out there that will chase any contract and make their nurses work any contract for the sake of making money. We're selective. We're selective in the contracts we take because some of them don't truly value who the nurse is. The environment. For years, my dad actually, they didn't allow employees to go to after hours events because their philosophy was, hey, look, like, you have families, we want you to get home to your families. We're not gonna, I don't know, they didn't allow, but it wasn't encouraged to go to after hours events because the point was you go back to your family. And so understanding how to create an environment where that nurse can thrive. It's big corporations often fall into micromanaging because they don't trust their people and they don't create an environment then where people can thrive. And because of that, you have to then create more and more checks and balances in order to keep people accountable. We all need accountability, but if you can create an environment that truly allows people to grow and to do what they do best, then as an owner, you're also in a better place because then you just trust the people that you work with. And I think there's a lot of power in that.
And you talk a lot in your book about the concept of what true freedom looks like versus what we believe freedom is. How do you determine the difference between those two?
It's so tough. It's so tough. I think that, and depending on who you are, honestly, Brent, some people have an innate ability, not an innate ability. We all have the innate ability. Some people have not lost their sense of self, and I meet free spirits sometimes, and these people who just like are so in touch with their intuition. And that's so powerful to me. My wife is like that. She's very in touch with her intuition. I think that, my book is about realizing how many things can get in between us and the voice of our hearts, and learning to question in a very loving way, not in a cynical way, because I think we can become cynical and we question everything. We don't want to believe, we become skeptical and we're negative about it. But questioning what we believe in a loving way allows us then to dive down into unpeel layers. For me, probably the single biggest, I had a conversation actually with a friend of mine. He's a dear friend, very accomplished person. And we were talking about that exact thing, like, how do you find the path? And I said, well, for me, it comes from a fundamental conviction that there is an order to creation. Like that is the one thing that I probably won't negotiate on, that I'm probably not open to being wrong on, is that there is an order to creation. Now, whether you call that God, whether you call that Buddha, whether you call that, a religion, whatever, there is an order. And I look at it, and it's the order that makes the sun rise every day. It's the order that, allows this tree to die and then come back. I don't understand it. I don't know who made it. I don't know, what his name is. I don't know necessarily how it all works, but there is an order. And I observe that order in my own life. And when I let go, I am brought to good things and to good places. And I look back at my whole life, and were there dark moments? Yes, but there's also been a bringing of me to an ever better place. So to answer your question directly, for me, how do I find it? Most often by letting go and allowing myself to be led. Singer made it popular in his surrender experiment. It is that concept that, like, if you believe that there's an order and there's a goodness, then you can surrender yourself to that. And that is what's going to show you the next steps you have to take.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. I think at the bottom of one thing that is non-negotiable for me as well is that we're here accidentally, and that we don't have a meaning and a purpose to be here. And so with that, I'm going to ask you probably the hardest question that people have been trying to answer through all of eternity. What is the purpose of our existence here? You've had a lot of time to think about these things, and now you're applying everything that you learned while you were in this religious order now into business life and family life and life in typical Western society. What's the point? What are we doing here?
The purpose of life is life. And I want you to think about that, not as a cop-out answer, but like actually give that some thought. One of the things that it gave me a lot of insight and helped me on my own path to, whatever you call it, enlightenment, growth, evolution, like, was to understand how linear Westerners are. Like even our Newtonian physics is very linear. It's A plus B equals C. It's like there's a line of progression going from here to there. I often, and I do say this in my book, like, my life always was a novel. It's like I am trying to get to some big glorious end, and there was going to be bagpipes at the end, fucking for sure, because I'm a fan of bagpipes, and like it's a novel. There's going to be a hero's ending, and you're going to arrive to whatever it is, heaven, inshallah. Like it's gonna like it's gonna be there, Valhalla, not inshallah. You're gonna arrive. My wife, gave me that insight years ago, and she's like, "You look at life like a novel. I look at it as a book of poems." Where every poem, every moment is its own poem. And the beauty is what's happening now. Is there heaven? Is there an afterlife? Is the goal that is that what the purpose is? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer. I can tell you what I believe, but I don't know if that's true. What I do know is that my greatest fulfillment, and I say this after having experienced all of it, after having worked towards salvation and worked towards heaven and worked towards understanding this and like tried every purpose that there is, my greatest joy, my greatest peace, my greatest satisfaction always comes from just living in the now. And that's an answer that we don't want to hear. We don't want to hear it because so many times we're not content in the now. So many times because we haven't found ourselves in the now. We haven't found ourselves in the present. And so we like, there's got to be something else. My invitation to people always is do the work, allow yourself to evolve, experience that present moment and how powerful that present moment can be, and then come back and let's talk. Let go of the concept that there has to be something beyond what you're just experiencing now. And again, my experience with that is that most people who are convinced there has to be something later, it's because they've never truly experienced lasting peace in the present moment. And when you experience lasting peace and lasting joy in a present moment, like I said, there may be something else, but I don't have a need for there to be something else because what's right here right now is so incredible. And if this is all that it's meant to be, then that's amazing. Like it's it's powerful. And that has radically changed the way I look at everything, the way I look at religion, the way I look at money, the way I look at politics, the way I look at evolution, the way I look at my soul and my heart. It's like, how do I truly immerse myself in this present moment and let go of questions that I can't answer? Because that's the reality, Brent, is that I don't know that you can know the answer to that. And so you waste so much time in trying to understand the purpose, whether you decide that a great spiritual leader like Jesus or like Mohammed or like anybody has said that this is the purpose, whether you go through your own theological, philosophical studies and you decide that this is the purpose, whether your parents told you what the purpose is, it's a question that we're never going to have the answer to. And so why waste time trying to figure that out when you can have amazing, perfect peace and contentment in the present moment?
Well, I'll tell you, David, I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. Um, Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Again, the offer is out there. The first 10 people that come back to me and say, "Hey, I want to read David's book," I will gladly send you a copy. Either if you saw this posted up on LinkedIn or obviously my contact information is on all the platforms that we have for the podcast. Just shoot me an email, DM me on LinkedIn, and happy to send out a copy because the book is the first part of the book is really gives you some background, David, on what your journey was, but it's really the rest of the book is you outlining a lot of your philosophy around living and living a good life. And I think that your ending comments there about being in the moment, it's incredibly hard to do because so many of us are caught up in past regrets or things we wish we had done differently, or we worry so much about the future that on my side anyway, one of the most powerful things I started doing several years ago was every night before I go to bed, I write down three things I'm grateful for. And we realize, and some days maybe it wasn't the best day in the world. It's like, well, I have clean, abundant running water, which most of the world doesn't have. But you think about it, it's like, wow, I had, both my parents are still with us, and I had lunch with my mother today. My son smiled at me, or we had a great conversation, had a wonderful, and it always comes down to people, really. The good days always come down to some interaction I had with people. But if you do that, you realize that every moment that you are here is an absolute gift, to your point. And I like that. The purpose of life is life. I'm going to have to meditate on that myself for a little bit and see exactly what that means. But this is a wonderful conversation. David, if people want to find you and want to learn more about your company, want to learn about your book, How do they do that?
You can certainly check out my website, davidyep.com. You can check out the company if you've got a workers' comp injury and need somebody, TRIUNE Health Group. .org. And I'm on Instagram, obviously, and TikTok, YouTube, where I love just connecting with people and, inviting you all to have this experience of now too. I don't preach it as the truth. I just share that it's my experience, and to find that beauty and power in the present moment has been incredibly enlightening for someone who's searched for so long.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us today. Appreciate it.
Amazing. Thank you. Thanks so much, Brent.
Yeah, the only thing I'm going to add to this conversation is amen. It was a great conversation. I
I could have gone for another 2 hours here, Bill.
Oh, I know. I could jump in here. I've got so many things and so many, and I'm not going to. I'm going to resist the temptation in the spirit of the conversation. Brent, for people who are listening to this conversation and thinking, well, this has been interesting. This doesn't sound like a financial advisor. Would one say, no, it's not your typical financial advisor. and for that, well, you can add that to my list of things to be grateful for tonight. But maybe somebody's listening, all jokes aside, and want to reach out and have a conversation with you about the more material things, the physical things, and how would they get a hold of you?
Yeah, and I do think, we obviously we've done 80 some episodes of this thing now, Bill, and it's not a typical financial podcast by any means, but I do think this is all wrapped in together. And I do think that as we live in an economic planet, and there's a lot of different ways that expresses itself. But yeah, if people want to reach out to us, our phone number here is 602-255-0555. Someone on the team or myself will answer that call. Very active on LinkedIn, put something up there almost every single day. Our website is tws.finance, again, tws.finance, and that has pretty much every conceivable way to reach myself or a member of my team, and would love to hear from listeners and get some thoughts and some feedback about what you think of these episodes. And please, like and subscribe to it, share it if you'd like, because love doing this. It's one of my favorite things I do every week is this podcast, and really grateful for anyone's taking the time to listen to these conversations.
Yeah, you mentioned hitting the follow button and subscribing. The benefit of doing that is that when you drop a new episode, those of you who are subscribers, you get notified. You can listen to it, and I would say if you like it, share it with people. Tell people about it. Word of mouth promotion is really great, and do take Brent up on that offer of giving him some feedback. Go over his website, give him reach out to him and say, yeah, that was an interesting conversation. I thought about this or that. And have you ever thought about that? But, interact with Brent. I would encourage you to do that, as a matter of fact. Until next time, I'm Bill Tucker, the producer, the guy back here, thanking you for taking the time to listen today. And I want to remind you that you can go out today and make today a great day or not. It's a choice, and it is yours to make. Until next time.